I'm Phil Gusson, Professor of Political Science at College of the Canyons, and in this video I'll be explaining Proposition 13 on the 2020 ballot. I want to start by addressing some misconceptions, especially based on some of the advertising that's been done about this proposition. First, Proposition 13 does not repeal the Proposition 13 that was passed in 1978 that limited the property taxes. It has no impact on that. Anybody who tells you that it does is misrepresenting it. The only thing Proposition 13, the one passed in 1978, and Proposition 13, the one on the ballot right now, have in common is their name. Second, whenever a school bond measure comes up, invariably people ask, well, what about the lottery? I thought the lottery was going to pay for all this. And so I want to be clear about this. The lottery was never intended to replace state and local funding, only to supplement it. But more importantly, as it relates to Proposition 13 on the current ballot, which pays for infrastructure within the schools, the money, although schools have a lot of discretion in how they use lottery money cannot be used for infrastructure expenditures. So that money couldn't even be applied to the things that are addressed in Proposition 13. It's important to keep these things in mind. So I want to start with some background first. Some things that are on the ballot, when we have multiple initiatives on the ballot, the way they get on the ballot is people stand around like in front of supermarkets and they get your signature. And if they get enough signatures, something will be on the ballot. This bond measure, the reason that it's on the ballot is because the state legislature, both the state assembly and the state senate, passed it, and it went to the governor, and the governor signed it. And as I'll explain in more detail later on, it was supported overwhelmingly by both Democrats and Republicans, but I'll talk about that in a second. School bond construction projects are always financed through state and local bond measures. And the state places limits on the amount of bonds that elementary schools, high schools, larger school districts, and community colleges are permitted to sell. Because when you sell a bond, essentially you're taking on debt. And so the state has placed a limit on how much debt they're allowed to take on. What Proposition 13 will do, if it passes, it will increase the amount of bonds that these institutions are allowed to sell, and essentially increase the amount of debt they're allowed to take on. So under the current law, elementary schools and high school districts can borrow only an amount equal to 1.25% of the local property values. That they're limited by that. If Proposition 13 passes, it will increase that ceiling from 1.25% up to 2%. But any increase and any bonds that are going to be sold will have to be put before the voters, and they would have to approve it. The larger unified school districts under current law and community college districts can sell bonds only to the value of 2.5% of their community's property value. If Proposition 13 passes, it will increase that limit up to 4%. But once again, subject to voters' approval. So they won't be able to do it on their own. They'll have to come back to us. The funding that would be raised by the selling of bonds will be for school facilities designated for 4 specific kinds of projects: renovation, some new construction, charter schools, and then career, technical, and educational facilities, vocational schools. The overall cost of the bond is it's a $15 billion bond. So this would allow $15 billion in bonds to be sold. But when bonds are sold to investors, they have to be paid back, and they have to be paid back with interest. According to the independent legislative analysts, after the money is paid back to investors and the interest is tacked on, the actual cost of Proposition 13 will be $26 billion. So that's the amount of bonds they sell plus the interest. It'll be paid over 35 years. $5.2 billion will be for renovating existing older buildings at primary and secondary schools across California. $2.8 billion will be reserved for new construction. $1 billion will be for career technical educational sites and charter schools, and the money would be evenly divided between the two. And then $6 billion will be spent evenly between the University of California colleges and the CSU systems and the community college system. So it'll be spread out among all those. The last major school bond measure passed in 2016 was Proposition 51. And one of the things about the application process to get these funds in Proposition 51 is that it made it kind of a race. Like the schools that had more resources to put together proposals to get the money that was available as a result of the selling of the bonds, they were more likely to get the money from that bond. They had the ability to get them, complete the applications, and submit them. Schools that came from poorer districts that didn't have those resources had more of a problem getting access to those funds. And so to the extent that there was a disparity between the colleges in terms of the schools and their resources, in many ways Proposition 13 just added to it. Proposition 51 added to it. Proposition 13 gets rid of the first come, first served basis. That was part of the problem with Proposition 51. Projects funded by Proposition 13 will be prioritized based on the impact that they have on the health and safety of students. And the highest priority would be given to projects in schools that had limited options. So the goal is to address seismic upgrades on campuses, removal of hazardous material like mold and asbestos, and then also it includes testing and treating lead in the school water supplies. So this is where the money would be spent. There's a cap of $750 million in bond funds that can be spent on administrative costs. The argument in favor of Proposition 13 is that it provides much needed renovations, that most of the funds would go towards modernization, not new construction, and that it'll help protect children from aging pipes and critical disrepair. And that it'll create a safer and better learning environment for students. Supporters also say that there's accountability measures in Proposition 13 that will help ensure that the funds will go directly to the schools that need them the most. Now, back to how it got on the ballot. It passed overwhelmingly in the state Senate and in the state Assembly. The Assembly voted in favor of this. There were 78 votes in favor of it and 1 no vote. In the state Assembly, there were 35 votes in favor of it and 4 no votes. For people in the Santa Clarita district, it might be helpful to know that Christy Smith, who's running for the 25th Congressional District, she voted yes on this. Scott Wilk, who is also running for re-election, a Republican, also voted yes. So whenever I see that Democrats and Republicans are coming together, I think that's worthy of notice because oftentimes it seems like Democrats and Republicans can't agree on what day it is. In terms of the organizations that have expressed support for Proposition 13, some of them make sense, the people who are going to benefit from them the most. California Teachers Association, the California Federation of Teachers, the UC Regents, the Community College Board of Governors, they all support this measure. And it has some other backers from the business industry, but it's reasonable to think that they have interest in passing this because they're going to benefit from it. In particular, the California Building Industry Association supports this. But it's interesting to note that the California Business Roundtable and the California Chamber of Commerce, organizations that typically are reticent about increasing debt, also support Proposition 13. The arguments against Proposition 13, at least on the ballot that they send, or the document that they send to us from the state, there were only 2 groups or 2 people that lodged an argument officially against it. There was one Republican member of the state legislature who I'm unfamiliar with, and then the Howard Jarvis Association. Now, for younger people, that's not going to make any, you're not going to know who that is. But for older people, you're going to know who Howard Jarvis is, especially as it relates to Proposition 13. But the argument against Proposition 13 is that it would increase the pressure to raise property taxes. The idea would be that now that state and local districts have the ability to take on more debt, they're going to come back to us and ask for that. They're going to come back to the voters. However, again, as I stated previously, any increase would have to be passed by the voters. The other part of Proposition 13 that opponents object to is that within the language of Proposition 13, it gives a favor to union labor, that union-only construction is preferred. And so what it does is it limits the amount of competition between union labor and private contractors, right? And that could ultimately increase the cost of some of the projects. So those are the arguments in favor, those are the arguments against. A yes vote gives the state the authority to, a yes vote increases the amount of debt that certain districts are allowed to take on, and increases and gives the state the ability to raise up to $15 billion in general obligation bonds to raise money for these projects. A no vote would keep things the way they are. Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful.